Well, greetings, everyone. This is a seminar on the transforming power of agape love. I'm Dr. Gordon Carkner. I'm an educator at University of British Columbia with graduate students, postgraduate students. I'm the author of The Great Escape from Nihilism, Mapping the Future, and 10 Myths About Christianity. This is my blog at ubcgcu.org if you want to tie into other conversations that we're having, and very much appreciate this chance to share with you this seminar on a very important topic. So we want to investigate the power of agape love. In a sense, it's a wager on deep meaning. I'm tying this in with a previous seminar on millennials, the existential identity crisis of millennials. And so we're going to say that this is part 2. So wisdom for millennials: diversity, pluralism, individualism, choice, digital literacy. These are the earmarks of contemporary millennials in Canada, particularly. I'm quoting from the book by the excellent resource by Reginald Bibby and his colleagues at the University of Alberta, called Millennial Mosaic: How Pluralism and Choice Are Shaping Canadian Youth and the Future of Canada. So how can millennials grapple with their identity crisis and expand their horizons? Where will they find the strength of identity, the wisdom, the courage, and inspiration to navigate our complex world? Dare they even speak of love in a cynical age? Yale psychologist Robert Sternberg writes, wisdom is involved when practical intelligence is applied to maximizing not just one's own or someone else's self-interest, but rather a balance of various self-interests: intrapersonal, with the interests of others, interpersonal, and of other aspects of the context in which one lives, extrapersonal, such as one's city, country, environment, or even God. If this seems to be complex, it is, and it requires serious commitment. The flight from such healthy dialogue into self-justifying, self-perpetuating jargon is a flight from adulthood, relationship, and creativity. Wisdom is a foundational virtue, a commitment to growth, to grow in insight and character throughout one's whole life journey. It entails the full picture, the natural and purposeful end of a moral and physical capacities, of our moral and physical capacities and intentions. It requires a vision of what is possible in a good life, in good lives shaping community together. So we want to put love and wisdom together, and we think that they are intimately interwoven. Well, what is love? This is a paraphrase from 1 Corinthians 13. Love is creative, gentle, and patient. Love is kind. It does not brag or judge or remember wrongs done. It forgives, heals, promises, promotes unity, looks for peaceful solutions. It perseveres patiently when weary. It understands human weakness and draws out potential in others. It believes in and takes responsibility for the well-being of the other. It is committed to the truth, not lies, spin, or deception. Love is unusually resilient, promotes compassion, community, and mutuality. It is, at the end of the day, formidable, a force to be reckoned with. It involves honesty, self-understanding, and humility. In one sense, it is superhuman, yet accessible and necessary for survival. So what does it mean to entwine or put together love and wisdom? This, I am suggesting, promotes transformation, personal transformation. If millennials reject the common quest for power, entitlement, and self-interest, reject the pride of ego, triumphalism, and radical individualism, if they reject the shallow quest for success, the naivety of relativism, and the fear of lacking more wealth and power, they will acquire wisdom and discover this deeper self, their what's called the soul. Love plus wisdom promotes a renunciation of privilege and entitlement in favor of servanthood, gratitude, and generosity. Instead of self-assertive power, we identify our weakness. Love wisdom realizes that God, by his grace, loves to work through such honest, fragile vessels. In poetic brilliance, the book of Proverbs reverberates with the lyrics of this outlook, the ancient ways, the high road of love, wisdom. In this sense, the cross itself is a kind of meta-critique of contemporary power interests. So how do we upgrade our humans through agape impact? Wisdom helps one in post-formal thought, the ability to think about complex issues in flexible ways. For example, learning through dialogue. It requires nuances, understanding of motivational complexity. Charles Taylor calls this a palette of assumptions, motives, and sensibilities that make us human. Wisdom is a key marker, an essential part of our emotional intelligence, or our EQ. It is critical to moral existence, to the thick self, the sticky communal self. Millennials will go deep with wisdom if they want to heal and move forward. Reminder from Tristan Harris at Silicon Valley, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who is concerned about the effects of social media these days. He says, at the same time we have been upgrading our machines, we have been downgrading our humans. He has a lot of play in this Netflix video called Social Dilemma, a documentary on social media. I believe that agape can be a kind of antivirus for millennial despair. So what does agape mean for the search for home, for identity, purpose, and meaning among millennials? Can such a love show us the path to the heart of profound meaning? Can it provide an exit from the mental hell of our pride, despair, and angst? Can it heal our broken relationships and meet us existentially at the center of our pain? Could this be the light at the end of the tunnel that we've been seeking for thousands of years? What one calls the Holy Grail. Loyola philosophy professor Paul K. Moser thinks so, and I quote him, "God's agape love, directed at the human conscience, is a deep invitational call to an existential depth." So what is the biblical breadth of the concept of love? I think in some ways today we desperately need a new script for our lives. We need a narrative. Biblically, the theme of love traverses the entire narrative from Genesis to Revelation, from the Big Bang fire of creation to the covenant love of Abraham, to the prophetic love that turns straying people back to God's care, to the exaltation of God's attentive care in the Psalms, thinking particularly Psalm 139, to unparalleled critical wisdom and compassion of Jesus of Nazareth, or Paul's brilliant teaching on love in his letters to young churches, to the promise of the new creation to come in Revelation, where our work developing the language of divine love pays off in eternity, face to face with love himself. It is inspiring, life-giving. It's an inspiring and life-giving narrative overall. In the Old Testament or the Hebrew Psalms, love is featured extravagantly to the full dimensionality of the human condition. And in the Hebrew, agape is translated ahavra. This is a lingua franca of heaven, of both Old and New Testaments, Jewish and Christian scripture. Jesus himself speaks agape, the agape language in the Sermon on the Mount. We might call this, again, the language of heaven. In Matthew 5, 1-20, Jesus' love sermon expresses these concerns. Jesus uses agape to divide selfishness from the self, sin from the sinner. Using critical wisdom, he challenges many of the religious systems of wisdom in place in his time. In the Sermon on the Mount, he messes with people's understanding of virtuous living. His wisdom is often countercultural, always discerning, sometimes mysterious, often employing a metaphoric social grenade that wakes up the listener. Remember the story of the uber-moral young prince who lacked the ability to show compassion for the poor. His wealth was his Achilles heel, blocking him from the kingdom of heaven, blocking him from, growing up. The Sermon on the Mount is a stance of hospitality towards the poor, the weak, and the homeless. They are highly featured. Found in Matthew's chapter 5 to 7 and reinforced in Matthew 25, the teaching lays out the tenets of life in a new community, a new human enterprise. It is a discourse on how we can internalize God's will, capture God's posture towards the world. The most radical statement comes with Jesus' challenge to love our enemies. And Martin Luther King was a good example of this, where he took the Sermon on the Mount seriously as a way of looking at his march for social justice. He believed in justice, love, and nonviolence. There is a transformational impact embedded in agape. God's love from first to last. God is love from first to last. He is love all the way down, as it says in 1 John 4. He's fully invested. The Sermon on the Mount deals with the deep things of the inner person and shows how love internalized can transform us from greed to radical generosity, from pride to deep humility, from violent brawlers to peacemakers, from narcissists to servanthood people. It claims a whole new posture of radical freedom in Christ, freedom to love beyond one's imagination, to be whole persons. Only a radical change in outlook and motivation can make it possible. Ultimately, as Amanda Cook sings in her song Closer, we can never really run or hide from such a love. How does agape love affect ethics and morality? Love is the perfect foundation and motivation for ethics, justice, positive freedom, empowering moral choice in startling ways. You might look at the book by Jim Wallace called The Uncommon Good to show how powerful agape love can be. If we're struggling today to discover a foundation for doing the right thing, as many writers say, our relationship to love is a key. Do we lean into it, open ourselves to it, or move away, shun it? Human relations at their best flourish in the nurturing agar of God's love. The more we anchor our identity in grace and gift love, the more fun, surprising, and rich life actually becomes. It is the ultimate good that rethinks all the dynamics of our existence, all our goals and purposes. In fact, our very calling in life. That bodes well for the cultural progress and mature identity, says Larry Siedentop in Inventing the Individual. And Tom Holland, who's actually an atheist, but really appreciates the impact of Christian agape love in changing the world from a more brutal Greco-Roman world to today. My PhD dissertation focused on this element of identity a fair bit in my dialogue between Michel Foucault and Charles Taylor on the reinvention of the moral self. Here are a couple quotes from mystic and contemplative Thomas Merton from his book, New Seeds of Contemplation, where he talks about the importance of unity over division. As long as we are on earth, the love that unites us will bring suffering by our very contact with one another, because this love is the resetting of a body of bones. Hatred recoils from the sacrifice and sorrow that are the price of resetting bones. It refuses the pain of reunion. Hatred is a sign and the expression of loneliness, of unworthiness, of insufficiency. Chantal Delsol talks about the importance of the distinction between diabolos and agape. Diabolos really is the principle of division, fragmentation, and isolation. Agape is the principle of unity, empathy, and mutuality. That was from her book, Icarus Fallen. We should recognize in every human being the same nature, the same needs, the same rights, the same destiny as in ourselves. But I cannot treat others as humans unless I have compassion for them. I must have at least as much compassion to realize that when they suffer, they feel somewhat as I do when I suffer. I must learn to share with others their joys, their sufferings, their ideals. their ideas, their needs, and their desires. For Christianity is not merely a doctrine or system of beliefs. It is Christ living in us, uniting men to one another in his own life and unity. I also wanted to claim that love sources and grounds human reason. You may recall the famous claim from René Descartes, French Enlightenment philosopher, I think, therefore I am, where everything starts with me, with the individual ego and how I think. Of course, on the alternative, you might say that Jesus would say, I love, therefore I am. The answer to the question of identity, says Stephen Long in his book, Speaking of God, the answer to the question of identity is to assume that love is as basic to our existence as reason, which is something that the great Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar endeavored to show. We do not understand reason well if it is unrelated to love. We can only know what we love and love what we know. Love is the perfection against which creation and reason appear. Only on the basis of an ontology of love can gift be understood. Because love and not pure reason is the basic structure of being, the failure of human reason to achieve its infinite desires is not negative, but positive. In this space, we discover fresh truth, overcome alienation from truth, and change our whole worldview. So I think at this juncture, I'd like to point out a grand existential choice that faces us today in the world. We can either choose rage on one hand or grace. Love, agape, offers a solution to the horns of a dilemma in the West called the crisis of affirmation. We're torn between self-hatred and spiritual lobotomy, or one might say moral suicide. We cannot seem to affirm both self and the world. The world is broken and corrupt, and we don't want to admit our complicity in the matter. Two choices remain open to us, writes Charles Taylor in The Sources of the Self, later in his book. And this is in his reading of Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. Our moral choices, our spirituality, and our identity intertwine at this point, and the consequences of these two choices are immense. The first is, and these are two different stances towards the world. The first, we blame the world for evil, suffering, and tragedy in order to preserve our love of self. We try to keep ourselves pure, blameless, above the fray. This is the route of self-righteousness, involving the powerful vice of pride. This posture leads to arrogance, hatred, resentment, terrorism, and violence. And we've seen lots of that in recent days. We self-justify, thinking that we are superior to the unwashed masses. This often results in destructive scapegoating behavior, such as we find in racism today, or other forms of bigotry. The second choice, B, we open ourselves to grace. In this scenario, we accept a God of infinite love. Thus, we can love both ourselves and the world despite its problems. We can accept that we are part of the problem and the solution of the world. We're part of the brokenness. In this stance, there is forgiveness and the possibility of transformation that makes us better people and the world a less violent place. That is why it's so challenging to discern. It requires some deep honesty. So we face a dramatic, significant choice between meaning and hope on one hand, or nihilism and despair on the other. So what would it mean to choose B? That is a kind of transcendent turn towards agape love in our day. This is a quote from Glenn Tinder, a political scientist from University of Massachusetts. He wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly in 1989 called, "Can We Be Good Without God?" And I think it's a very profound quote. Agape is a prophetic love. It refuses to equate anyone with his immediate observable being. A human being is not deeply and essentially the same as the one who is visible to the employer, neighbor, salesman, policeman, judge, friend, or spouse. A human being is destined to live in eternity and is fully known only to God. Agape is about the spiritual destiny of the individual. Destiny is a spiritual drama. My destiny is my own selfhood given by God, but given not as an established reality like a rock or a hill, but as a task lying under divine imperative. Agape is simply the affirmation of this paradox and of the destiny underlying it. Agape looks beyond all marks of fallenness, all traits by which people are judged and ranked, and acknowledges the glory of each person as envisioned in the Christian faith, the glory that's gained from the creative mercy of God. It sets aside the most astute worldly judgment on behalf of destiny. This is from his book, The Political Meaning of Christianity, which followed through from that article. So there's a breakthrough insight here, a kind of epiphany, I guess you might say. Epiphanies suggest transcendence, something wholly other. Charles Taylor sees a parallel between the epiphanies of art and poetry in the 19th and 20th centuries and the I-thou epiphany of religious encounter with the divine. He elaborates the concept of epiphany in his book, Sources of the Self, and here are the references. He sees post-romantic and modernist art as oriented to epiphanies, episodes of realization, revelation, or disclosure. Epiphanies and epiphanic art are about a kind of transcendence, about the self coming in touch with that which lies beyond it, a ground or qualitative preeminence. One could call it a gift to the imagination or re-enchantment of reality. Another author, George Steiner, calls it real presence. So the connection between epiphany and the transcendent. We propose that such epiphanies of agape love are a tangible possibility. That would be the main thesis of this whole presentation. The strong version of transcendent means that while such love comes from outside human culture, from divinity, it offers transforming dynamics within the economies of the full range of culture spheres here on earth, in science, the arts, ethics, and religion. Taylor believes that this epiphanic discovery of agape love can indeed act as a hypergood. It influences a rearrangement of the hierarchy of one's moral goods or values, bringing into play both a transfiguration and transvaluation within the very frame of the moral self. This enables self-transcendence, growth, and humility. There is motivation for embracing the good, sacrificing self-interest for the other, facing one's own pain and corruption honestly. And here's a blog from my site on that topic as well. So let's brace for impact. We have evidence from millennial history, of human history, to prove the veracity of agape. Agape sees everything differently. It creates infinite value in life, in individual lives, as the heart and soul of all values and virtues. It rearranges the hierarchy of goods in life. It speaks of moral excellence. It is the long game of life, the ultimate purpose of all life's struggles and endeavors. It has big impact, enduring power, transforming society as well as the individual. And we see a great statement on this by Larry Siedentop in Inventing the Individual. So our wager on agape is looking quite worthwhile. Further, agape looks like exceptional hospitality. This I draw from Richard Kearney, a philosopher over at Boston College. This is the concept of love after the cultural death of God, after Marx and Freud and Nietzsche. What does agape look like when implemented in practical ways, even amidst cynicism? Hospitality bears witness to the meaning of grace with nature and eternity with time. In Jesus, God demonstrates what humans are like when they're truly and fully alive. He's the great gift of self-giving compassion to the least of these, as we see in Matthew 25. He's the bread from heaven broken for us, the cup of self-sacrifice showing the way through Gethsemane. It may come as a stark realization that we mere humans are created to be hosts of the divine in this world, living out the calling of creation, day 7. In this light, we host the sun in every act of service, love, and care towards other human beings. Through such profound hosting, we make him present to our friends, neighbors, in a special way. So the economy of grace and the human drama. The intentional will to life celebrates a dynamic, vibrant economy of grace, the transcendent in the immanent, the divine word in human flesh, the cup of cold water for the thirsty soul. We gladly purge ourselves of the illusion of power and greed in order to recognize our responsibility, our obligation, and our call in the face of the other, as we see in Emmanuel leaving us, and in relation to the biosphere of God's beloved creation. This posture leads us into an experience of epiphany, again, a breakthrough illumination. It can mean a divine encounter itself. We see the world through refreshed eyes, accept a change in the calculus of life, and deepen our identity by caring for the distant stranger, the outsider, the immigrant, the alien other, the person of difference. David Brooks has a beautiful articulation of this in his book, The Second Mountain, The Quest for a Moral Life. So this epiphany of agape love involves also a kind of conversion, involves a true conversion or reconfiguration, redirection of self and its passions. As we learn the art of hosting in this way, the sacred shows up dramatically within the context of the secular, kairos within chronos, as we commit to self-giving agape in the name of our Trinitarian God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. As Paul writes about Christ in Philippians 2, we must first go down. We must first self-empty, self-offer in order to go up. The hermeneutic of this posture in life is superabundant grace all the way down. Within this economy, this stance, we naturally become the resistance to radical evil by becoming whole, complete human beings, building our capacity to love, honoring the sacred in the everyday, casting off the mask of the false self, and building bridges. This reaches the pinnacle of resilient human existence. It offers the ultimate life-changing solution to the angst, despair, inequality, desperation, alienation, and tribalism of our age. I like this quote from Merton to cap this, this whole concept of the epiphany of agape. To be grateful is to recognize the love of God in everything he has given, and he has given us everything. Every breath we draw is a gift of his love. Every moment of existence is a grace, for it brings with it immense graces from him. Gratitude takes nothing for granted, is never unresponsive, is constantly awakening to new wonder and to praise of the goodness of God. For the grateful person knows that God is good, not by hearsay, but by experience. And that's what makes all the difference. At the end of the day, you are what you love. Practice agape. Step into love. Open yourself to God's infinite love. It adds such quality to life, containing within its purview the path to joy. Philosopher James K. Smith, in his book, You Are What You Love, articulates a powerful trajectory of love in the everyday. He also is a fan of Charles Taylor, and he offers excellent insights into how life is lived to the full. Here's a quote from him. We all live and long for a social vision of what we think society should look like, some vision of the good life, some picture of flourishing. Our most fundamental orientation to the world is love. We adapt ways of life that are indexed to such visions. It captures our imagination. This is the weight of our love, says James Smith. So in summary, I would like to just capture what we've talked about so far: the transforming power of love, millennial angst, existential insecurity, encounters agape. It is explosive. This may be the most important wager of our time. An existential crisis can only be met by a deep existential call. It involves a leap of faith into the light, into that which lies beyond our control. It confronts us with a loving God and a wonderful economy of grace. This is not just a myth to make us feel good. A transcendent turn to agape is both a choice and a risk. Only love will save us, not money, power, fame, or happiness. We stand in awe before the immensity of it all. This is the high, ancient path trodden by the great saints of history: hospitality, compassion, unity, peacemaking, gratitude, gift, truth. We are called to live in such a way that it just doesn't make sense unless God exists. From this, life emerges as a shared moral drama, a pilgrimage towards goodness, purpose, and community. We open our hearts, let down our guard, and place our doubts to the side. This is the way forward for resilient people moving into adulthood, unafraid to be vulnerable. Millennials need a modern exodus out of the slavery to ego, Gnosticism, scientism, relativism, individualism, materialism, and nihilism. After a turn to agape, they will experience the subterranean presence of grace in the world they thought they once knew. Capture the sacred in the everyday. They will encounter epiphany, transcendence, presence, and wonder. They will come alive in spirit, in moral agency, in meaning and identity. You too may find yourself hosting the Son of God, that is infinite goodness, in your backyard. Here's some bibliography to help shape these new horizons for millennials and for others. I've mentioned some of these to start with, and just the ones that I haven't mentioned. So down towards the bottom third is Stephen Klein, his Science of Happiness from a Psychological Perspective. And Paul Moser and Thomas Carson, their books, Morality and the Good Life and Moral Relativism, a reader. And also I haven't mentioned, but Brene Brown is famous for her Daring Greatly, a book on vulnerability and the importance of vulnerability. So my final word to you is, let love be your North Star.